All right, so as Dr. Shikande just said, my name is Nyree Dowdy, and I'm going to be presenting my thesis about updating representations of slavery in museums in the Southern United States. So essentially, what I was talking about in this paper is just the fact that through their exhibitions and programming, Southern history museums have contributed to a gap in the collective memory as it regards to the topic of slavery. So basically, what I wanted to do is create a timeline of how slavery in history museums in the South has changed over time, if at all. And this is kind of the overview that this presentation is going to take, starting with how I got interested, why this project matters, my methods, terms that are important for this, looking at the past, present, and future, and then just a few other things before my conclusion. So why did I decide to research this topic? The first thing is actually going to be Core 301, which I took with Dr. Marr. In that class, we had to do a report on the origin of something, and my group chose to do the origin of museums. And we kind of talked a lot in that class about some of the controversies facing museums nowadays. And one of the things that we talked about was actually Southern plantation museums. And so I went around the room and asked a few questions. Some of the questions were like, have you been to a plantation museum? Different things like that. And one of the questions that I asked was, has anybody been on a field trip where they're asked to like pick cotton? And a few people raised their hand like they had done that before. A few people looked like they knew what I was talking about. And then there were a few people who were like, what? Like that is a thing that people do on field trips? And it was really interesting to me because I later found out that a lot of the people who hadn't heard of that at all were from different states or different regions. And I thought that that was interesting that although we're learning about the same historical events, where you come from really matters in regards to how you see it presented in a museum. So the second reason I wanted to do this is because I have worked in museums. I used to be a guide at the Cyclorama at the Atlanta History Center, which is a Civil War painting that opened up in 2019. And essentially, decades ago, it was represented in a very different light. It was represented more as a Confederate victory. And when it came to the History Center, they basically acknowledged that, you know, this picture isn't perfect. It was painted after the Civil War by people who weren't there for it. But I noticed that when I was giving the tour, I was talking to a lot of guests who were older and they had seen the older version and they had a completely different perception. And they thought that we were changing history by presenting it in this different way. That was another way that I realized we were kind of separated along different lines. And then finally, just personal reasons, as a Black woman in America, I'm concerned with how people that look like me are being represented, because it matters not only for today's society, but also for the people that are going to see future generations that are going to see these museums afterwards. And also, I would like to see how other marginalized communities are represented, because I want to be educated properly about those other groups as well. So this is kind of a quote that was driving me through all of my research. Basically, it's a quote that's on the going back. Quote that's on the American Alliance of Museum website. And it basically states that museums are like the most trusted source of information over nonprofit research, US government, all of these other things. And I thought that that was really interesting because I feel like if you ask most people, I wouldn't think that they would say museums because I see museums as a place for vacation or just a field trip. But it shows that people are really putting a lot of intention in what they learn in museums and that they carry it with them for a long time. So why does this matter? And why do I have a salad bowl on this page? I will get to that. So we probably know the United States as a melting pot, or at least that's what we used to call it. It's since evolved to be called a salad bowl. And that's because you see these distinct cultures coming together and then you can separate them out and kind of still see where they originated. So I would argue that by having only one representation or one perspective in museums, it's like having a salad with like only lettuce or only mushrooms. Like I think you can do that, but it probably wouldn't be as good as it would be if you had all of these perspectives coming together. So essentially, this matters in that it is giving us a wider picture, a fuller picture of history, and it's highlighting the contributions of marginalized groups, in this particular case, the Black community. So, methodology. Um, there are a lot of resources currently about researching slavery in museums because it's a particularly hot topic right now. So there was a lot for me to look at. Starting at the top and then going clockwise. So for the first picture, that's the picture from the website of Colonial Williamsburg. So first place I went to is museum websites. How are they representing slavery nowadays as told by themselves? Moving to the next picture on the right, I took a look at books. There are a lot of dedicated guides for museums about how they can represent these topics. So how are museums implementing what is being told in these guides? At the bottom, I actually got to do a few museum visits, not that as many as I wanted to do, of course, with the pandemic, but that picture is of the old Slave Mart Museum in Charleston, South Carolina. And that's one of the places that I actually got to visit. And then moving to the last picture on the left, that is a picture of a screenshot of a podcast by the Telfair Museum, which is in Savannah. So although I wasn't able to actually go to all the museums, I was able to hear some of the content from their tours. So as far as looking at key terms that I discussed in my paper, I'm just going to be discussing these terms and how they related to my research. So first, for museums, there are all kinds of museums of all different disciplines, but I focus specifically on historic sites and history museums, just because those are the museums, of course, that are mostly going to be the ones that have these representations of slavery. That is not to say that like art museums don't have to reckon with slavery. That's actually a trend that we've seen recently in like slavery captioning of adding these things to tell you more context about the people you're seeing. But just for the scope of this essay, I focused on history museums and historic sites. For number two, defining slavery, again, a bit hard to do just because it's not a monolith. As you go to different regions, different countries, slavery is going to look different. So in saying Southern slavery, it's a little bit limiting just because, you know, slavery differs from different states, different plantations. So it's kind of hard to place that label on everything, and you have to recognize each experience as unique. And for the third term, public history, pretty straightforward history that we present to the public. Kind of going back to what I said earlier about how the historical events haven't changed themselves, but we have changed how we show them in public spaces. All right, so taking a look at the past, this is a picture from Gone with the Wind. So you have Miss Scarlett O'Hara right here in the front. It is a beautiful, idyllic picture, and this is a lot of what we're going to see in Southern history museums in the first part of the 20th century after the Civil War. A lot of this is going to be perpetuated by the Daughters of the Confederacy, which is an organization that is set up to preserve Southern heritage and kind of present this particular image. They're going to be the people that are putting up a lot of the statues around the South that we see of Confederate generals. So if you go to a lot of plantation sites at this point, you are mostly not going to see Black people represented, just because if you go back to that intention of museums as places of things that we want to remember, a lot of times Black people aren't going to be considered important enough to be in these spaces. Also, you're going to see that if they are represented, they're going to be misrepresented. So there's going to be a lot of stories of, well, slavery wasn't that bad here, and the slave owner was benevolent, and they were like family, and those kind of stories are being perpetuated, which of course we know are myths and not true. So actually, what we see in due to this representation is a splitting off. So this is actually one of the first representations of slavery and history museums in a museum that's run by Black people. So this is going to be a picture of a museum at Hampton University, which is a historically Black college and university in Virginia. And so these are going to be the first places that recognize, hey, I'm not seeing myself represented accurately in those other museums, so I'm going to create my own thing. And so this is where we see a split, and you're going to see these smaller museums that are centered around African American history and culture. The thing with these museums, though, is that it is seen as, at this point, you know, if you want to learn about that history, you can go to that place, which it shouldn't be. Although these institutions are great and they are a great addition, it shouldn't be the only place that we're learning about this history, because American history involves all of us. So we should also be in the mainstream museum representation. All right, so I'm going to step outside of the South just for a second, just to talk about a comparison. This is the DuSable Museum in Chicago. This is going to be a museum in continuing through the 20th century. We're going to see a lot of museums popping up in response to those problematic representations. So this is an example of one that we're going to see in the 60s. And I think that that was important just to highlight that in the height of the civil rights movement, among all of these other important rights being fought over, one of the most important rights was also the right to be remembered. So this is one of the largest that we're going to see. And the only reason I wanted to include it is to show the comparison to the South, where you have these plantations already set up, whereas in the North, you can have these communities that have moved there from the Great Migration and they can start their own thing. Whereas in the South, not that in the North you're not under Jim Crow, but there's a stark difference in how things are going to be as far as your ability to kind of have something like this come into existence. All right, so moving into the later 20th century, we see more mainstream museums deciding that they actually need to do something. So in 1979 is when Colonial Williamsburg in Williamsburg, Virginia, is going to start its African American programming. A lot of other museums are going to follow suit and kind of have their own divisions. But an issue that we're going to see with this is that a lot of them are still being spearheaded by white curators who are not consulting the Black community. So they are doing it from their point of view. And oftentimes you're still getting a little bit of confusion about what exactly should be represented. And that comes with controversy. So this is actually one of the biggest examples. In 1994, Colonial Williamsburg hosted a mock slave auction, which was protested by the NAACP. Which what is actually interesting about this one is that it was hosted by a Black curator. So some people were questioning if it was problematic or if it should happen. Her argument was that people need to see the truth. But like I said, the NAACP protested it and said that it went too far and that we didn't need to see this in 1994. So you see a lot of confusion like this about what exactly is too far. And just these shifting ideas about what is okay in a museum setting. What's really going to help is when the American Alliance of Museums, which is kind of the spearheading organization in America, is going to come out with their standards. So this is a phrase a lot of us have probably heard recently: diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion. This is the statement that's on the American Alliance Museums website. And essentially, it's just talking about how museums should be open to all. And what's important about them recognizing it is that it shows other museums its importance and shows how important it is as far as implementing it in all other museums. So the question is, why is it so hard for museums to get this right? And there's a few reasons for this. One of them is that museums inherently have colonial roots. Museums were created as spaces for wealthy, mostly white people to show off their goods to their wealthy friends. And these spaces have often maintained that same air. Today, about 9% of core museum viewership is going to be people of color, and about 20% of museum staff is going to be people of color, but mostly they're going to be in roles like custodians or security guards. So again, you don't have those different perspectives to kind of inform how you're educating people, which is what makes it kind of hard to get things right. Also, you're going to see the fact that these types of museums are inherently emotional places. People have a lot of their sense of identity tied to these stories. So it's kind of hard to please everyone when you're presenting these stories because people have such strong responses to things that are being represented. So I do want to talk a little bit about other influences just because I've spoke a lot about museums. Obviously, there are other influences. People have their family histories. There's K through 12 education, what you learn in your textbooks. We have up in the corner our favorite like Southern ghost tours and all those kind of things that are also going to be informing people about historical events. And then, of course, we have small plantation museums that continue to this day to kind of have that Gone with the Wind story going on. And my objective is not like everybody go out right now and rip up all the textbooks and tear down all the museums and like let's start over. I think that if we can get enough of a correct representation in mainstream museums, then at least the people that are going on these other things and have these other ideals will have to hold up a mirror to their beliefs and kind of confront them in these mainstream museums. So looking to the future about museums that are doing a great job as far as interpreting slavery, we have the Whitney Plantation in Louisiana, and then we have the International African American Museum, which is going to be opening in 2022 in Charleston, South Carolina. And this is actually built on the port where about 40% of enslaved people are going to come into the Americas. So these are really significant sites. And what you see is a movement away from sharing sort of that, like, this is an object behind glass, just look at it and that's the whole story. It's more of creating a narrative and kind of making a memorial for these people. So basically, what museums need to do and moving on is moving towards hiring more people of color, move towards consulting communities of color in general in the local area, asking them what they do and do not want to see. There needs to be an effort to recruit underrepresented communities as far as getting them to be staff in museums. Um, Other than that, museums just need to admit that there's an issue and not pretend that they're perfect. No site is going to ever be perfect. There's always more research you can do to improve. So the first step is just admitting that you need to take a look at yourself and kind of reevaluate. And then lastly, I just want to talk a little bit about everyone's responsibility. I encourage everybody to be a conscious consumer of museums. So often we want to go into a museum space and just hear someone talk for 20 minutes and then like that's the whole thing. No, you should be asking these people what are their sources, where are they learning this from, what historical documents can they point you towards that are justifying what they're saying. And that is really how we're going to be able to kind of rebuild these museums. When you see something problematic, don't just let them say it. Like ask them like how they're basing that on like all these different things. So basically, through us working to be more conscious, and through museums working that way, which is how we're going to fix things. So the next time that you go into a museum or a historic site, ask yourself whose story is being told and whose story is being left out. Thank y'all.